A millionaire hired an ex-convict to care for his mother with terminal cancer. One night, when he opened the bedroom door at dawn, he was terrified by what the man had done to his mother. The silence of dawn was broken by a terrifying sound that echoed through the corridors of the mansion. Benjamin awoke startled in his luxurious suite, his heart racing as he heard that dry and desperate cough coming from the room next door. At 42, this man of elegant bearing and graying hair at the temples had built a business empire, but at that moment felt completely useless. His hands trembled as he ran down the marble corridor toward the sound that terrified him more than any business meeting. "Mother, I'm here. Hold on, please," he shouted, trying to mask the desperation in his deep, authoritative voice. Margaret's bedroom door opened forcefully, revealing a scene Benjamin would never forget. His mother, a 70-year-old woman who had once been the strong and decisive matriarch of the family, was hunched over the bed, her delicate hands holding a handkerchief already soaked with blood. Her white silky hair was disheveled, framing a pale face where her blue eyes, once bright and full of life, now reflected profound pain and extreme fatigue. Benjamin felt his legs weaken at the sight of the woman who had always been his emotional fortress. "Benjamin, my son, I can't anymore. It hurts too much," Margaret murmured between violent coughs, each word coming out as a whisper laden with suffering. Urgency took hold of Benjamin as he approached the bed, his brown eyes filled with tears he tried to contain. Margaret was wearing a light blue silk nightgown, the same one she had worn for years, but which now seemed too large on her fragile and emaciated body. Her hands, once firm to give advice and affection, trembled uncontrollably as she tried to sit on the edge of the bed. Benjamin could see the protruding veins in her arms, the result of numerous treatments she had endured in recent months. Her bare feet touched the cold floor, and he noticed how she had lost weight, how her shoulders were curved by the exhaustion of the disease. "Son, I feel as if my chest is on fire. It's as if something is corroding me from inside," said Margaret, grabbing Benjamin's arm with surprising strength for someone so debilitated. Benjamin held Margaret's cold hands, feeling the rough texture of her skin, which had once been soft as silk. He was a tall man, standing at 1 meter and 85 centimeters, accustomed to commanding meeting rooms and making quick decisions, but there he was completely lost. His Italian silk suit, which he had worn at the previous day's business meeting, was wrinkled, and his tie hung loose around his neck. His dark hair, always perfectly combed, was disheveled, revealing the haste with which he had awakened. As he observed his mother's suffering, Benjamin felt a crushing weight of guilt in his chest, remembering all the times he had prioritized important meetings instead of being by her side. "Mother, I'm going to call the ambulance right away." "You'll be fine, I promise I'll take care of everything," he stated, trying to project confidence while his voice trembled with emotion. With quick and precise movements, Benjamin picked up the golden telephone on Margaret's bedside table. His fingers dialed the emergency number while he tried to remain calm, watching his mother writhe in pain on the bed. The soft light from the crystal lamp illuminated the elegantly decorated room, with antique dark wood furniture and burgundy velvet curtains, but all that opulence seemed insignificant in the face of Margaret's suffering. She had lain down again, breathing with difficulty, her eyes closed in an expression of pain that broke Benjamin's heart. The Persian rug beneath his feet absorbed his nervous steps as he waited for the call to be answered. "I need an ambulance urgently. My mother is very ill. She has cancer and is coughing up blood. Come quickly, please," Benjamin said into the phone, his voice echoing through the amplitude of the luxurious room. While waiting for the ambulance, Benjamin sat on the edge of the bed beside Margaret, observing every detail of the face he had known since childhood. The wrinkles around her eyes told stories of smiles and worries, of sleepless nights caring for him when he was little, of sacrifices she had made so he could build his fortune. The soft lavender perfume she always wore was still present, now mixed with the medicinal smell that seemed to permeate everything around her. Benjamin held her hand, feeling how the gold rings she had always worn were loose on her thin fingers. The pearl bracelet that had been a gift from his father still adorned her delicate wrist, a reminder of the happy times that now seemed so distant. "Benjamin, I don't want you to feel guilty. You've always been a good son." "I know your business affairs are important," mumbled Margaret, opening blue eyes that still shone with maternal love despite the pain. The minutes seemed eternal until Benjamin heard the sound of sirens approaching the mansion. He rose quickly, adjusting the silk robe that Margaret wore over her nightgown, trying to preserve her dignity even in that moment of vulnerability. His hands trembled as he smoothed her white hair, an affectionate gesture he had learned by watching her do the same to him when he was a child. Margaret tried to smile, but the pain in her chest was visible in every line of her pale face. Benjamin could hear the hurried steps of the paramedics climbing the marble staircase of the mansion and felt a mixture of relief and terror for what was to come. "Mother, they're coming. Everything will be fine." "I'll be with you every second," promised Benjamin, kissing Margaret's cold forehead with infinite tenderness. The paramedics entered the room with professional efficiency, bringing with them medical equipment and a stretcher. Benjamin observed their every movement, feeling helpless as they examined Margaret and checked her vital signs. She was conscious, but clearly weakened, responding to the paramedics' questions with a feeble voice. The room, which had always been a sanctuary of peace and elegance, was now overtaken by medical urgency. Benjamin followed alongside the stretcher as they transported Margaret through the corridors of the mansion, passing family portraits that documented decades of happy memories. The butler, William, a 60-year-old man who had worked for the family for more than 20 years, appeared in the hallway in his pajamas, his dark eyes full of concern as he saw his employer being taken away. "William, take care of the house." "I'll be back as soon as I can," said Benjamin, his voice carrying authority even amid desperation. The journey to the hospital was a silent torture for Benjamin, who followed the ambulance in his luxury car, driving through the empty streets of dawn. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles whitened by tension. He tried not to think of the worst, but images of his mother coughing blood repeated in his mind like a horror film. The light from street lamps created dancing shadows inside the car, and Benjamin found himself making silent promises to any higher power that might be listening. He thought of all the business trips he had made in recent months, all the meetings he had prioritized, all the moments he could have spent with Margaret but chose to work instead. "Mother, I promise I'll make up for all the lost time. I'll be here for you now," he muttered to himself, accelerating to keep up with the ambulance. At the hospital, Benjamin nervously paced the waiting room, his Italian leather shoes echoing on the cold, sterile floor. The hospital environment contrasted drastically with the luxury of his mansion, with simple white walls, plastic chairs, and the characteristic smell of disinfectant. He had quickly changed clothes, now wearing dark dress pants and a white shirt, but still felt out of place in that environment. Other patients' family members occupied the chairs around him, some sleeping uncomfortably, others crying softly. Benjamin observed every movement of the doctors and nurses who passed by, trying to decipher in their faces some clue about Margaret's condition. The fluorescent ceiling light created a cold and impersonal atmosphere that made him feel even more anxious. Please let her be okay. I can't lose her now. Not when I finally understand how much she means to me, thought Benjamin, interlacing his fingers in a silent prayer. After what seemed like endless hours, a doctor approached Benjamin. Dr. Richardson was a middle-aged man, with graying hair and experienced eyes that had seen much suffering. He wore an impeccable white coat and carried a clipboard with Margaret's tests. His serious and compassionate face indicated that he had experience giving difficult news to family members. Benjamin stood up immediately, trying to read the doctor's expression, mentally preparing himself for any news he might receive. The doctor gestured for him to sit down, a movement that Benjamin interpreted as a bad omen. "Mr. Benjamin, I need to talk to you about your mother's condition. It's important that you understand exactly the situation we're facing," said Dr. Richardson, his voice calm but laden with gravity. Benjamin sat on the edge of the plastic chair, leaning forward so as not to miss any of the doctor's words. His hands were intertwined, fingers pressed so tightly that his knuckles were white. Dr. Richardson consulted his papers before speaking, mentally organizing the words he knew would be difficult to hear. The environment around them seemed to have grown quieter, as if even the other patients and family members respected the gravity of that moment. Benjamin could feel his heart beating so strongly that he was certain the doctor could hear it. The fluorescent light above them flickered occasionally, creating an even more tense atmosphere in the waiting room, already loaded with emotions. "Doctor, tell me the truth. I need to know exactly how she is." "I can face anything, I just can't face lies or half-truths," said Benjamin, mentally preparing himself for the impact of the words that were to come. Dr. Richardson took a deep breath before beginning to explain, his words measured and careful. He had learned over the years how to convey difficult medical information without completely taking away the hope of family members, while being honest about the reality of the situation. Benjamin observed every expression on the doctor's face, trying to interpret not just his words, but also what he wasn't saying. The hospital environment around them continued with its nightly routine, nurses passing with medications, family members of other patients dozing in uncomfortable chairs. But for Benjamin, nothing existed beyond the words he was about to hear. His hands trembled slightly, and he pressed them against his legs to try to control them. "Mr. Benjamin, your mother's cancer is in a very advanced stage. What happened today was a serious complication. The cancer has already consumed almost everything. She needs comprehensive care," said Dr. Richardson, carefully observing Benjamin's reaction. The doctor's words hit Benjamin like a punch to the stomach. He had always known that Margaret's cancer was serious, but he had always maintained a secret hope that the expensive treatments he paid for could reverse the situation. Now, hearing the raw truth from Dr. Richardson's lips, he felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath his feet. His eyes filled with tears that he tried to contain, biting his lower lip hard. The world around him seemed to have become blurred, and he had to concentrate to be able to breathe normally. Benjamin rested his head in his hands, feeling the crushing weight of the reality that had just been presented to him. All his wealth, all his business power, all his important connections meant nothing in the face of the disease that was taking his mother away. "Doctor, how long does she have? I need to know so that I can be with her," asked Benjamin, his voice almost a whisper broken by emotion. Dr. Richardson leaned slightly forward, his expression compassionate but realistic. He had learned that family members needed time to process difficult information, but also needed honesty to be able to make important decisions. Benjamin raised his head, quickly wiping away the tears that insisted on falling, trying to recover the composure he had always shown in difficult business situations. But this was different from any negotiation he had ever faced. This was about the life of the most important person in his existence. The silence between them lasted a few seconds that seemed eternal, while the doctor carefully chose his next words. Benjamin felt as if he were suspended in time, awaiting a sentence that would change his life forever. It's difficult to be precise in cases like this. It could be weeks, maybe a few months if she responds well to palliative treatment. The important thing now is to ensure that she has quality of life and is surrounded by love, explained Dr. Richardson, briefly touching Benjamin's shoulder in a gesture of support. Benjamin remained silent for a few minutes, processing the information he had just received. His rational businessman's mind tried to organize the next steps, but his son's heart was shattered. He thought of all the conversations he still wanted to have with Margaret, of all the advice he still needed to hear from her, of all the moments he had lost working when he could have been by her side. Tears ran down his cheeks without him trying to stop them, a sign of vulnerability he rarely allowed others to see. The doctor remained there, respectful and patient, understanding that this man needed time to absorb the magnitude of the situation. Benjamin wiped his face with the back of his hand, trying to recover some of his usual composure. "Dr. Richardson, I want to give her everything possible, the best treatments, the best care. Money is not a problem. I just want her not to suffer," said Benjamin, his voice filled with determination mixed with desperation. The doctor nodded understandingly, recognizing the love and devotion in Benjamin's voice. He explained about the palliative care available, about the importance of keeping Margaret comfortable and surrounded by people who loved her. Benjamin listened attentively to every word, asking questions about medications, about equipment he could buy, about specialists he could hire. It was his way of dealing with helplessness, trying to use his financial resources to make some difference in the situation. Dr. Richardson patiently answered all questions, but also emphasized that the most important thing now was the love and presence of family. Benjamin began to understand that there were things his money couldn't buy, like more time with his mother, or a miraculous cure for her illness. "Mr. Benjamin, I can take you to see your mother now. She is stable and has specifically asked to speak with you. She wants to go home," informed Dr. Richardson, rising from his chair. Benjamin stood up immediately, adjusting his shirt and running his hands through his hair in a nervous gesture. He followed the doctor through the hospital corridors, observing the night movement of healthcare professionals. The smell of disinfectant was strong, mixed with the aroma of coffee coming from the doctor's lounge. His footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor, creating a measured rhythm that contrasted with the acceleration of his heart. Benjamin was trying to mentally prepare himself to see Margaret in that hospital environment, connected to medical equipment. They passed several rooms where other patients were sleeping or receiving treatment, reminding Benjamin that suffering was a reality shared by many families. The corridor seemed endless, each step bringing him closer to an encounter he knew was crucial. "Doctor, is she suffering a lot? Is there anything we can do to decrease her pain?" "I can't bear to see her like this," questioned Benjamin as they walked, his concern evident in every word. When they reached Margaret's room, Benjamin paused for a moment at the door, emotionally preparing himself for what he was about to see. The room was simple but clean, with an adjustable hospital bed and some basic medical equipment. Margaret was awake, propped up on pillows, looking small and fragile in that sterile environment. Her blue eyes lit up when she saw Benjamin enter, and she extended her hand toward him. He approached quickly, holding her hand carefully, noticing how cold it was and how her veins were more visible. Margaret's white hair was spread over the pillow, and she wore a light blue hospital gown that made her look even paler. Benjamin sat in the chair next to the bed, getting as close as possible to his mother. "My dear son, you came. I was so afraid that you would be too busy to come see me," said Margaret, her voice weak but filled with relief and love. Benjamin held Margaret's hand with both hands, bringing it to his lips to kiss it softly. His eyes were full of tears again, but this time they were tears of love and not just despair. He observed every detail of his mother's face, trying to memorize every line, every expression, every nuance of her voice. Margaret smiled weakly, a smile that still carried all the maternal sweetness that Benjamin had known since childhood. The heart monitoring equipment emitted a regular beep, a constant soundtrack that reminded both of the fragility of the situation. The soft light in the room created a more welcoming atmosphere than the corridor, and Benjamin felt a little more relaxed being there with his mother. "Mom, I'm never too busy for you. You are the most important person in my life." "I'm sorry for all the times I wasn't here," said Benjamin, his voice trembling with sincere emotion. Margaret squeezed Benjamin's hand with all the strength she still possessed, her eyes shining with tears of joy for having her son there with her. She had spent many nights alone in the mansion, hearing only the ticking of the old clock in the hallway, wishing Benjamin would come home earlier from business. Now seeing the genuine concern and love in his eyes, she felt that all those lonely nights were worth it, if they brought this moment of closeness between them. Margaret's face, despite the paleness and fatigue, radiated a peace that Benjamin hadn't seen in a long time. She raised her other hand, gently touching Benjamin's face, feeling the unshaven beard and the lines of worry around his eyes. "Benjamin, my dear son, I don't regret anything. You have always been my greatest pride." "I just want you to know this," murmured Margaret, each word pronounced with effort but loaded with deep meaning. Tears flowed freely down Benjamin's face as he listened to his mother's words. All the guilt he carried for having prioritized work, all the meetings he had considered more important than time with Margaret, all the remorse he felt for not realizing sooner how much she was suffering, all of this mingled with the unconditional love that had always existed between them. Benjamin kissed Margaret's hand again, closing his eyes to feel the texture of her skin and the warmth that still emanated despite her condition. The silence between them was comfortable, carrying decades of love and mutual understanding. Margaret observed the son she had raised, seeing in him not just the successful businessman he had become, but also the vulnerable boy that still existed within him. "Mother, I promise that from now on, you will be my priority. I will cancel all trips, all meetings. "I want to spend every moment by your side," promised Benjamin, sealing his words with a kiss on Margaret's forehead. Margaret smiled through tears, touched by the sincerity and determination in Benjamin's voice. She'd always known that, beneath all his ambition and dedication to business, he was fundamentally a good and loving man. During all those years, she had never criticized him for working so hard because she understood that he was building a legacy. But now, seeing the love in his eyes, she felt that everything had been worth it. The medical equipment around them continued monitoring her vital signs, subtly reminding them of the reality of her condition. But at that moment, mother and son were focused only on each other. Margaret took a deep breath, preparing to make a request that she knew was important for both of them. The light in the room seemed warmer now, creating an atmosphere of intimacy that contrasted with the typical coldness of hospital environments. "Benjamin, I have a request to make, something very important to me. I need you to listen with an open heart," said Margaret, her voice gaining surprising strength. Benjamin leaned in closer, firmly holding Margaret's hand as he awaited her words. He was prepared to fulfill any request she made, regardless of the cost or difficulty. His brown eyes were fixed on his mother's blue eyes, communicating without words that he would do anything for her. The atmosphere in the room was charged with emotion, and Benjamin felt that this would be a decisive moment in their lives. Margaret breathed slowly, mentally organizing the words she wanted to say, knowing that this request would change the dynamics of their last weeks or months together. The distant sound of other patients and nurses in the corridor created a background noise that reminded both of them that life continued beyond that room. But for them, nothing else existed beyond that intimate moment. "My son, I want to go home. I don't want to die here in the hospital, connected to machines. I want to feel my home one more time," said Margaret, her tears flowing silently as she expressed her deepest desire. Margaret's request hit Benjamin like an overwhelming emotional wave. He immediately understood the depth of what she was asking, not just to return home, but to have control over her final moments of life. Benjamin thought about the mansion where Margaret had raised her family, where each room carried memories of happy moments, where she truly felt at home. The idea of losing her was terrifying, but the idea of denying her this last request was unthinkable. He squeezed her hand more tightly, feeling the weight of the responsibility to make her last days as comfortable and dignified as possible. Tears continued to run down his face, but now they were tears of determination mixed with sadness. "Mother, you are going home. I will arrange everything. The best home medical care. Everything you need. You will be in your own room, in your own bed, as I promise," responded Benjamin, his voice loaded with emotion and absolute resolution. 3 days after Margaret's return from the hospital, Benjamin found himself in the spacious living room of his mansion, a polished mahogany table in front of him covered with resumes and documents from caregiver candidates. The luxurious environment, with its Italian leather armchairs and Persian rugs, contrasted with the anxiety that overtook him as he leafed through the papers with growing frustration. Margaret had been comfortably installed in her room upstairs, with medical equipment discreetly positioned, but Benjamin knew he needed to find someone qualified quickly. The golden afternoon light streamed through the large glass windows, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air, creating an almost melancholic atmosphere in the room where he used to receive important business partners. William, the faithful butler, had organized a series of interviews, but so far none of the candidates had impressed Benjamin. "I need to find someone special, someone who understands that my mother is not just another patient. She deserves the best care there is," Benjamin muttered to himself, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of mental exhaustion. The first candidate of the afternoon was a middle-aged woman with 20 years of experience in home care. She entered the room with confident steps, wearing an impeccable white uniform and carrying an organized folder with impressive certificates and references. Benjamin observed her attentively as she sat in the armchair across from the desk, noting her professional posture and the way she methodically organized her documents. She spoke with authority about nursing techniques, palliative medications, and medical protocols, demonstrating technical knowledge that should have impressed Benjamin. Her dark eyes were serious and focused, and she gestured precisely while explaining her experience with terminal patients. However, Something about her purely clinical approach bothered Benjamin, as if Margaret were just another case in her career, a number in her professional statistics. "Ma'am, what is your philosophy about caring for people in terminal condition? How do you view the emotional aspect of this work?" asked Benjamin, looking for some sign of genuine compassion beyond the cold technical competence. The candidate adjusted herself in the chair and responded with words that sounded rehearsed and mechanical, talking about maintaining professional distance and focusing exclusively on the necessary medical care without personal involvement. Benjamin noticed that she avoided prolonged eye contact and seemed more interested in discussing salary and benefits than in knowing details about Margaret as a unique person. When he mentioned that his mother had terminal cancer, with only a few months to live, she nodded coldly and commented on the importance of not creating unnecessary emotional bonds with terminal patients to maintain professional efficiency. The coldness of her response made Benjamin feel a knot in his stomach, imagining Margaret being treated as a clinical object instead of a loved person who deserved dignity and care. The conversation continued for a few more tense minutes, but Benjamin had already mentally decided that, despite all her undisputable technical competence, she was not the right person to care for his mother in the most vulnerable moments of her life. "Ma'am, thank you very much for your time. We will contact you soon with our decision. Mr. William will escort you to the exit," said Benjamin politely, but with a definitive tone that clearly indicated the end of the interview. The second candidate was announced, a nurse specialized in palliative care, who presented himself as a tall, thin man with gold-rimmed glasses and a formal posture that made him look more like a hospital administrator than a home caregiver. He entered the room carrying a black leather briefcase and wearing a dark suit that made him seem out of place for the intimate and personal type of work that Benjamin had in mind for his mother. During the initial conversation, David demonstrated extensive knowledge about medical equipment and hospital protocols, but when Benjamin asked about his experience with patients in home environments, he admitted that he preferred hospital settings because they were more controlled and predictable for medical work. Benjamin noticed that David constantly checked his expensive watch and seemed anxious to finish the interview, as if he had more important commitments waiting for him. When questioned about how he would handle the difficult emotional moments that would inevitably arise during the care of a terminal person, David responded coldly that he always maintained professional objectivity and avoided excessive emotional involvement that could compromise his clinical judgment. "Mr. David, I understand your professional approach, but I'm looking for someone who sees my mother as a special person, not just as a medical case," responded Benjamin, already feeling that this would not be the ideal person either. He continued the interview talking about rigid medication schedules, hospital hygiene protocols, and the importance of keeping detailed records of all procedures performed with scientific precision. Benjamin listened with growing discomfort, imagining Margaret being treated like a scientific experiment instead of receiving the maternal affection she so deserved in her final moments of life. When he casually mentioned that he only worked 8-hour shifts and didn't accept extended night duties due to personal commitments, Benjamin realized that this man wasn't prepared for the type of full-time and unconditional dedication that Margaret's care would require 24 hours a day. The conversation ended cordially, but Benjamin already knew that David wasn't the person he was looking for to accompany his mother in her final moments. After his departure, Benjamin sat back at the table, feeling frustrated with the difficulty of finding someone who combined technical competence with genuine human compassion and total dedication. Is it too much to ask to find someone who will treat my mother with love, someone who understands that each day could be the last, someone who makes her an absolute priority, thought Benjamin, nervously leafing through the remaining resumes on the mahogany table. After 2 more equally unsuitable candidates, who quickly passed through the room, demonstrating either glaring inexperience or inappropriate attitudes for the delicate situation, Benjamin began to feel genuinely desperate at the possibility of not finding anyone appropriate. William discreetly entered to check if Benjamin needed anything and observed his employer's frustrated expression, wordlessly understanding the difficulty he was facing in this crucial search. The butler, who had known Margaret for decades and deeply respected her as the family matriarch, was also concerned about finding someone suitable to care for her with the dignity she deserved. Benjamin stopped in front of a family portrait, showing him and Margaret in happier times, when she was still healthy and vibrant, radiant in a blue dress that highlighted her eyes. The image painfully contrasted with the current reality, reminding him of how precious time was and couldn't be wasted on unsuitable candidates who didn't understand the emotional urgency of the situation. "William, how many candidates do we still have for today? I'm beginning to lose hope of finding someone who really cares about my mother as a person," said Benjamin, his voice laden with growing frustration and emotional fatigue. When William announced the next candidate with certain hesitation in his voice, Benjamin barely raised his eyes from the papers on the table, mentally expecting yet another disappointment in his series of failed interviews. However, when the door slowly opened, he found himself observing a man completely different from all the previous candidates he had met. Marcus entered the room with measured and confident steps, but there was something about his presence that immediately captured Benjamin's full attention. He was a man of approximately 35 years, of medium height, but with broad shoulders that suggested physical strength developed through hard manual work. His dark hair was cut short, almost shaved, revealing a face marked by experiences that Benjamin couldn't immediately identify. Marcus's brown eyes had a particular depth that spoke of intense experiences lived, a penetrating quality that suggested someone who had seen much in life and learned difficult lessons. Marcus wore a simple blue cotton shirt and dark pants, modest but clean and well-kept clothes that contrasted with the formal attire of previous candidates. "Good afternoon, Mr. Benjamin. My name is Marcus. I've come for the caregiver interview. I hope I can help your family during this very difficult time," said Marcus with a deep and respectful voice, maintaining direct but not challenging eye contact. Benjamin gestured for Marcus to sit in the armchair facing the desk, carefully observing each movement of the man with growing curiosity. There was something different about Marcus, a quiet but alert presence that suggested someone accustomed to difficult and challenging situations. When Marcus sat down, Benjamin noticed the small but visible scars on his hands, marks that spoke of manual labor and possibly past difficulties that had left their physical marks. His muscular arms displayed tattoos that extended from the sleeves of his shirt, designs that Benjamin couldn't completely identify, but that clearly told a complex personal story. Marcus's eyes were the most impressive, dark and deep, with a quality that suggested someone who had thought deeply about life and its complexities. Benjamin began the interview with standard questions about experience and qualifications, but Marcus responded in a completely different manner from the other candidates he had interviewed. Instead of listing certificates or mechanically enumerating previous jobs, he talked about his philosophy of care, about how he deeply believed that each person deserved dignity until their final moments. "Mr. Benjamin, I don't have formal nursing diplomas, but I learned to care for very sick people. I learned that sometimes genuine compassion is worth more than any advanced medical technique," said Marcus, his words carrying genuine conviction that resonated deeply. Benjamin leaned forward, intrigued by Marcus's honest and direct response that dramatically contrasted with the rehearsed answers of previous candidates. He specifically asked where Marcus had learned about medical care, preparing himself for a conventional response, about courses or hospital experience. The answer he received caught him completely by surprise and unexpectedly changed the entire course of the interview. Marcus explained calmly, without trying to hide or minimize, that he had learned these skills in prison, where he spent 3 years and where he cared for many sick inmates who did not receive adequate medical attention from the deficient prison system. He spoke about how he had developed simple but effective methods to alleviate pain and discomfort, using limited resources but applying much care and personal dedication to each person he helped. Benjamin felt an initial shock upon hearing about Marcus's prison past, but something in the honest and direct way he addressed the issue prevented Benjamin from immediately rejecting him without consideration. Marcus did not try to hide, justify, or minimize his past, but he also did not dwell excessively on it, focusing instead on how that difficult experience had taught him valuable lessons about human suffering and the importance of compassion. There was a maturity in his words that spoke of someone who had deeply reflected on his experiences and learned from them constructively. I understand that my past may be a problem for you, but I can guarantee that I learned a lot about caring for people who are suffering. People who need love and attention more than expensive medications, said Marcus, maintaining direct eye contact while awaiting Benjamin's reaction. At that crucial moment, William discreetly entered the room to check if Benjamin needed anything, but stopped abruptly when he saw Marcus sitting in the armchair. The experienced butler immediately recognized some telling signs of the candidate's prison past: the visible tattoos, the characteristic alert posture, the specific haircut that indicated recent institutionalization. William approached Benjamin discreetly and whispered softly in his ear, his words carrying genuine concern and protective alertness. Benjamin felt his body automatically tense upon hearing William's confirmation about Marcus's past, but something powerful prevented him from immediately ending the interview as his first reaction suggested. There was something in Marcus's eyes, a sincerity that deeply intrigued him, and he decided to continue the conversation despite the legitimate reservations that were beginning to form in his cautious mind. Marcus clearly noticed the exchange of whispers between Benjamin and William, and his expression remained calm but vigilant, as if he were completely accustomed to facing prejudices and judgments based on his complicated past. William left the room, casting a clear warning look at Benjamin, evidently uncomfortable with Marcus's presence in the mansion and concerned about security implications. "He's an ex-convict. Mr. Benjamin, I believe you should consider this information very carefully. It's a very big responsibility," whispered William before withdrawing, leaving Benjamin alone with Marcus again in a tense silence. Benjamin remained silent for several long moments, carefully processing the information he had just received and trying to reconcile his positive initial impressions with legitimate security concerns. He observed Marcus attentively, trying to read beyond the surface and understand the man who was sitting before him. Marcus remained quiet and respectful, but Benjamin could see that he was prepared for any decision, without arrogance or unnecessary defensiveness, just a mature acceptance of the consequences of his total honesty. Benjamin decided to be completely direct and specifically asked about the crime that had led Marcus to prison, mentally preparing himself for an answer that could definitely end the interview and his considerations. Marcus took a deep breath before answering, explaining with complete honesty that he had been convicted of theft during an extremely difficult period of his life, when he was desperate to get money for expensive medications for his sick sister who had no resources. He didn't try to justify or minimize his wrongful actions, but explained the personal circumstances that led him to make desperate decisions, always maintaining a tone of complete personal responsibility and genuine remorse that was impossible to question. Benjamin continued the interview, asking more specific questions about how Marcus would handle complex medical situations that might arise. Marcus responded with detailed descriptions of simple but effective techniques he had learned to alleviate pain and discomfort, from gentle massages to the careful use of hot and cold compresses, breathing methods to reduce anxiety, and practical ways to create a calm and comforting environment for people in intense suffering. "Mr. Benjamin, I cannot change my past, but I can promise that I use everything I've learned to help people. In prison, I saw a lot of pain and suffering. So I learned that small acts of kindness can make an enormous difference in someone's life," said Marcus, his voice loaded with sincerity that deeply touched Benjamin. Benjamin was genuinely impressed with Marcus's practical knowledge, who, although lacking formal medical education, demonstrated a deep and intuitive understanding of what really mattered in caring for terminally ill people. Marcus spoke eloquently about the importance of listening attentively, of being present in body and soul, of touching with gentleness when appropriate, of creating moments of peace and tranquility amid inevitable suffering. His words revealed someone who had thought deeply about the true meaning of caring for others, not just as paid work, but as a form of personal redemption and greater life purpose. Benjamin found himself increasingly interested and involved in what Marcus had to say, despite his initial and legitimate reservations about his complicated criminal past. When Marcus described how he had cared for an elderly man during his last days in prison, providing not just physical care, but also emotional companionship and spiritual consolation, Benjamin felt something move in his heart. The genuine passion in Marcus's voice when talking about helping others was undeniable and authentic, and Benjamin began to seriously question his initial automatic prejudices. Benjamin felt torn between his increasingly positive impressions of Marcus as a person and potential caregiver, and his absolutely legitimate concerns about safety and social suitability for his vulnerable mother. "Mr. Marcus, I need to be completely honest. Your experience and attitude impress me deeply, but my mother is in a very vulnerable state. I need to think carefully about all aspects of this crucial decision," said Benjamin, his voice clearly revealing the intense internal conflict he was facing. Marcus nodded understandingly, demonstrating that he perfectly understood Benjamin's legitimate concerns and didn't feel offended or rejected by his natural and responsible caution. He volunteered to undergo any background check or psychological evaluation process that Benjamin considered necessary, showing complete transparency about his situation and willingness to prove his suitability. Benjamin was impressed with Marcus's emotional maturity, who seemed completely prepared to face consequences and judgments without unnecessary defensiveness or bitterness. At that decisive moment, Benjamin made an impulsive decision that completely surprised him, asking if Marcus would like to meet Margaret before he made his final definitive decision. Marcus immediately accepted the invitation, but with additional consideration suggested that Benjamin first explain to Margaret about his complicated past, demonstrating genuine consideration for her vulnerability and sincere desire to avoid any uncomfortable or embarrassing surprise. Benjamin admired this additional and spontaneous consideration, seeing in it more convincing evidence of Marcus's genuinely attentive and respectful character. The decision to introduce Marcus to Margaret represented a considerable risk, but Benjamin intuitively felt that his mother might be the best final judge of Marcus's suitability for the crucial role. "I'll go upstairs and talk to my mother first. Dear, if she agrees to meet you. I think it will be a good way to assess whether you have the necessary connection for this very important work," said Benjamin, feeling surprisingly confident in his impulsive but well-founded decision. Benjamin climbed the stairs toward Margaret's room, his thoughts intensely swirling as he tried to process everything that had happened during the transformative interview with Marcus. He paused for a moment in the silent hallway, trying to mentally organize how he would present the complex situation to his mother without unnecessarily frightening her, but also being completely honest about the candidate's complicated past. Benjamin gently knocked on the bedroom door and entered, to find Margaret awake and relatively alert, reading a book in bed, looking more animated than she had been during the past difficult days. Her eyes visibly lit up when she saw Benjamin enter, and he approached to affectionately kiss her forehead, feeling grateful to see her in a relatively good moment. Benjamin sat in the familiar chair beside the bed and began telling her about the frustrating interviews of the day, describing the technically competent but emotionally cold candidates he had met and his growing frustration with the search. Margaret listened patiently, occasionally asking insightful questions that demonstrated her sharp understanding of the difficult situation Benjamin was facing. When Benjamin began to describe Marcus, carefully choosing his words to present both the impressive qualities and legitimate concerns about his past, Margaret listened with full attention. "Son, you found someone special, someone you think could understand me, not as a patient but as a person," asked Margaret, her blue eyes shining with genuine curiosity and renewed hope. Benjamin explained in detail about Marcus's impressive sincerity, his deep understanding of palliative care developed through practical experience, his touching philosophy of dignity and compassion, but also about his time in prison and the circumstances that led him there. Margaret listened attentively to every word, asking occasional questions about specific details, especially about how Marcus had spoken about caring for others and his attitude toward human suffering. Benjamin carefully observed Margaret's reactions, looking for signs of fear or discomfort, but instead saw growing interest and curiosity in her experienced eyes. Margaret asked about Marcus's appearance, about his manner of speaking, about the general impression he had made on Benjamin as a person. Her questions revealed that she was evaluating Marcus not just as a professional caregiver, but as a person who would spend her precious final moments beside her. Margaret's intuition, developed over 70 years of life, was clearly working to form an opinion about this man whom she had not yet personally met. Benjamin, you said he talked about dignity, about treating people with respect until the end. That deeply touches my heart. I would very much like to meet him personally, said Margaret, her voice revealing genuine interest and openness that positively surprised Benjamin. Benjamin went downstairs to get Marcus, finding him exactly where he had left him, sitting calmly in the living room armchair, thoughtfully looking through the window at the well-maintained garden. Marcus respectfully stood up when Benjamin entered, awaiting instructions without pressing or showing excessive anxiety that might be interpreted as desperation. Benjamin explained that Margaret had agreed to meet him, but reiterated the absolute importance of being gentle and respectful, given her fragile state of health and emotional vulnerability. Marcus nodded seriously, assuring Benjamin that he completely understood the delicacy of the situation and would approach Margaret with all the care and respect she deserved as a person and as a mother. As they climbed the stairs together in respectful silence, Benjamin discreetly observed Marcus, noting how he moved with quiet confidence but without arrogance, how his eyes discreetly observed the elegant details of the house without seeming invasive or inappropriately curious. There was something genuinely comforting about Marcus's calm presence that Benjamin couldn't fully explain, an intuitive feeling that this man truly cared about others' well-being in an authentic way. Remember, my mother is very fragile physically. Yeah, but she is still a very perceptive and intelligent woman. Be yourself. But be respectful above all, said Benjamin, as they walked down the hallway toward Margaret's room, preparing for an encounter that could determine the future for all of them. Benjamin carefully opened the door to Margaret's room and entered first, respectfully followed by Marcus, who discreetly stopped near the entrance until formally invited to approach. Margaret was sitting elegantly in bed, supported by soft pillows, wearing a pink silk robe that enhanced what little natural color remained in her pale cheeks. Her white hair was carefully combed, and she wore her favorite pearl necklace that had been a wedding gift, details that showed she had prepared especially for this important meeting. Benjamin made the introductions formally, carefully observing the reactions of both as they greeted each other with mutual courtesy. Marcus approached the bed with slow, measured steps, stopping at a respectful distance and bowing slightly in a gesture of natural deference that revealed basic education despite his humble origins. His eyes met Margaret's with genuine respect, but without excessive timidity, and Benjamin noticed how Marcus's calm presence seemed to bring an immediate tranquility to the room's atmosphere. Margaret observed Marcus attentively with her experienced blue eyes, examining not just his physical appearance, but also his manner of behaving, the respectful way he addressed her, the evident respect in his body posture. Lady Margaret, it is an honor to meet you. Benjamin has told me much about you. I hope to be able to help you in this difficult time in the best way possible, said Marcus, his voice deep but soft, carrying genuine sincerity that even Benjamin could feel filling the room. Margaret gently gestured for Marcus to sit in the chair beside the bed, and Benjamin noticed how he patiently waited for her to repeat the invitation before sitting down, demonstrating consideration for social hierarchy and respect for her vulnerability. Margaret began asking simple questions about Marcus's experience, but Benjamin intuitively perceived that she was more interested in how he responded than in the specific answers he gave. Marcus spoke honestly about his past, about how he had learned to care for sick people, about his personal philosophy of dignified treatment for all, regardless of their circumstances or social origin. Benjamin watched fascinated as a silent but powerful connection seemed to form between Margaret and Marcus, something intangible that transcended the words being politely exchanged. When Margaret specifically asked about the last person he had cared for, Marcus took a deep breath before emotionally telling about Manuel, an elderly man in prison who had developed lung cancer and was slowly dying without adequate medical care. His voice became visibly softer as he described how he had spent dedicated weeks by Manuel's side, learning about his life, his distant family, his deep regrets, and his final hopes. Margaret listened with tears shining in her eyes, clearly touched by the genuine compassion Marcus had shown for a stranger in his final moments. Manuel taught me that dying with dignity doesn't depend on where you are, but on who is with you. "John, knowing that someone cares enough to stay until the end," said Marcus, his words carrying deep emotion that resonated intensely in both Margaret and Benjamin. Margaret extended her delicate hand toward Marcus, a spontaneous gesture that surprised Benjamin with its powerful symbolism and emotional meaning. Marcus respectfully hesitated for a moment, clearly aware of the gesture's importance, before extending his own hand to delicately touch hers with complete reverence. Benjamin watched fascinated and moved as his mother held Marcus's hand, her eyes closed as if feeling something beyond the simple physical touch, as if she was evaluating his soul through the human contact. When Margaret opened her eyes again, there was a clear determination in them that Benjamin recognized from important moments throughout his life, moments when she made definitive decisions based on her developed intuition. The connection between Margaret and Marcus was palpable in the room, a silent but deep understanding that transcended their different origins and completely distinct life experiences. Benjamin felt an intense mixture of relief and apprehension, realizing that his mother was about to make a decision that would irreversibly change the dynamics of her final days. Margaret looked directly into Marcus's eyes with an intensity that made Benjamin hold his breath, knowing that this moment would determine the immediate future for all of them. Marcus gently squeezed Margaret's hand, his eyes filling with tears that he made no attempt to hide, showing authentic emotional vulnerability. Benjamin could see that this moment was affecting Marcus deeply, that he fully understood the magnitude of the trust that Margaret was about to place in him. "Marcus, I feel in my heart that you understand what truly matters. You understand that I'm not just looking for medical care. I'm looking for someone who will help me die with true peace and dignity," said Margaret, her voice firm and determined despite her fragile physical condition. Benjamin felt an intense whirlwind of conflicting emotions as he processed Margaret's clear and definitive decision. Part of him was still concerned about the practical and social implications of having an ex-convict caring for his vulnerable mother, but another part was deeply touched by the obvious and authentic connection that had formed between Margaret and Marcus in such a short time. He thought about all the technically qualified but emotionally inadequate candidates he had interviewed, his growing hopelessness of finding someone appropriate, and the perfect irony that the most emotionally suitable person had arrived with the most socially complicated past. Margaret continued firmly holding Marcus's hand while looking directly at Benjamin, waiting for his final decision. But there was an unwavering determination in her eyes, suggesting she had already made her definitive choice, regardless of Benjamin's approval. The emotional tension in the room was palpable, as three lives balanced at the crucial moment of a decision that would permanently change everything for all of them. The atmosphere was charged with emotion and deep meaning, as if they all intuitively knew they were experiencing a moment that would definitively define the remaining days of Margaret's life. "It's him, Benjamin. I only trust him to be with me until the end," said Margaret, her final words carrying an unwavering certainty that resonated through the silent room like a final and irrevocable declaration. A week had passed since Marcus began caring for Margaret, and the transformation in the mansion's atmosphere was undeniable to everyone who frequented it. During that golden autumn afternoon, Marcus carefully pushed Margaret's wheelchair along the stone paths of the meticulously maintained garden, his slow and deliberate movements demonstrating the special attention he devoted to her every need. Margaret was wrapped in a soft lavender wool shawl, her delicate hands resting in her lap as she observed the flowers she loved so much, a gentle smile illuminating her pale face in a way that hadn't happened for months. The garden was especially beautiful that season, with red roses still blooming in the well-organized flower beds and the sweet perfume of flowers mixing with the aroma of dry leaves that began to cover the ground in golden and orange carpets. Marcus stopped the chair near the wrought iron bench where Margaret used to sit reading on warmer days, carefully adjusting her position so she could contemplate the birds flying among the ancient trees. "Lady Margaret, the afternoon is so beautiful today. The flowers seem to be smiling especially for you. How are you feeling in the open air?" asked Marcus with his deep and caring voice, leaning slightly to better hear her soft response. Margaret breathed deeply the fresh afternoon air, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. a tranquility that seemed to emanate not only from the serene environment, but from the comforting presence of the man who had become much more than a simple caregiver. Her blue eyes shone with a renewed vivacity as she watched butterflies dancing among the colorful petals, and her voice, although still weak, carried a genuine joy that touched Marcus's heart deeply. During those days together, Margaret had discovered in Marcus not just competence in medical care, but a gentle soul who understood her emotional needs in a way that surprised even herself. He had quickly learned her preferences, from how she liked to be positioned in the chair to the times of day when she preferred contemplative silence or friendly conversation. The connection between them had deepened naturally, based on mutual respect and a silent understanding that transcended the differences in age and social background that might have been obstacles in other circumstances. "Marcus, dear, you can't imagine how wonderful it is to feel the wind on my face again. It's been so long since I felt truly alive." "You brought me back to the world," said Margaret, extending her hand to briefly touch his arm in a gesture of deep gratitude. Marcus smiled with genuine happiness upon hearing Margaret's words, feeling truly useful and fulfilled in a way he had never experienced throughout his difficult and challenging life. He had discovered that caring for Margaret wasn't just a job, but an opportunity for personal redemption that gave new meaning to his existence and helped him find peace with his turbulent past. During that week, he had established a careful routine that combined the necessary medical treatments with activities that provided joy and emotional comfort to Margaret, always respecting her physical limitations but encouraging her to participate in life as much as possible. He had closely observed her moods and energy, learning to recognize the signs that indicated when she was feeling better or when she needed more rest, adapting their activities according to the specific needs of each moment. Marcus's dedication went beyond basic care, including small gestures of affection such as arranging fresh flowers in her room, reading to her when she was too tired to hold a book, and sharing stories that made her smile even in the most difficult moments. "Mrs. Margaret, seeing you smile like this is worth more than any payment. That's what motivates me every day, knowing that I can make a difference in your life," Marcus replied, his voice laden with sincere emotion and renewed determination. As they continued their tranquil walk through the garden, Marcus began to share with Margaret some stories of his personal journey of transformation, carefully choosing episodes that illustrated his evolution as a person without going into disturbing details about his previous life in prison. He told her about a gardening program he had participated in during his detention, where he learned to cultivate medicinal plants and discovered the therapeutic power of working with the earth and seeing things grow under his care. Margaret listened with genuine interest, asking insightful questions that demonstrated her curiosity about the human capacity for change and redemption, themes that had always fascinated her throughout her life, rich in experiences and observations. Marcus described how he had helped create a small garden in prison, where he grew herbs that were used to make calming teas for other inmates who suffered from anxiety and insomnia, an activity that brought him purpose and taught him about the value of caring for others, even in the most adverse circumstances. The conversation flowed naturally between them, creating an atmosphere of respectful intimacy that allowed Margaret to feel truly understood and valued as a person, not just as a patient who needed medical care. "It's amazing how people can change when they find a true purpose in life. You've taught me that it's never too late to discover our capacity to love and care." "That's a precious gift, Marcus," said Margaret, her eyes shining with genuine admiration for the transformation journey he had shared. From the mansion's terrace, Benjamin observed the scene in the garden through the large glass windows, his feelings oscillating between relief at seeing his mother apparently happy and a growing unease that he couldn't completely explain nor rationally control. He had spent the week discreetly monitoring the interaction between Margaret and Marcus, looking for signs of any inappropriate or suspicious behavior, but all he observed were dedicated care and moments of genuine joy that his mother hadn't experienced in months. During those days, Benjamin had tried to keep himself busy with his business, but found himself constantly distracted by thoughts about the situation at home, questioning whether he had made the right decision by allowing an ex-convict to become so close to Margaret in her most vulnerable moments. His mother's evident happiness should have been enough to calm his concerns, but instead, the growing closeness between her and Marcus began to awaken an uncomfortable feeling of loss of control over the situation. Benjamin knew his feelings were contradictory and possibly unfair, but he couldn't shake the sensation that he was losing his mother to a stranger whose past remained largely unknown to him. Margaret's soft laughter echoing from the garden should have been music to his ears, but instead it served as a reminder that she was finding comfort and joy in someone who wasn't him. Why do I feel this anxiety when I should be grateful? She's clearly better with him than she has been with me in recent months, but something doesn't leave me at ease, thought Benjamin, clenching his fists while continuing to observe the scene through the window. At that moment, Benjamin was interrupted in his reflections by the unexpected arrival of David, his neighbor and longtime friend who lived on the adjacent property and occasionally visited the family for social conversations or business discussions. David was a conservative 60-year-old man, successful in the real estate business, known for his firm opinions on security and social order, and who had always prided himself on keeping his family and property protected from any influence he considered dangerous or inappropriate. William announced David's visit, who entered the room with his imposing presence and greeted Benjamin with the firm handshake that characterized his social interactions. David had noticed unusual movement on the property during the week and decided to make an informal visit to verify if everything was well with the family, especially considering Margaret's delicate condition, which was known and respected throughout the neighborhood. After the initial greetings and some courteous questions about Margaret's health, David approached the window and observed the scene in the garden, his expression visibly changing when he noticed the unknown man pushing the wheelchair of the family's matriarch. His experienced eyes in evaluating people quickly noticed details about Marcus that aroused his attention and immediate concern. "Benjamin, who is that man with your mother? I don't remember seeing him before, and from what I can observe, he seems to have characteristics that leave me, how can I say, concerned about safety," said David, his voice laden with insinuations that Benjamin immediately understood. Benjamin felt a tightness in his stomach as he realized the direction the conversation was taking, knowing that he would have to explain the complicated situation to David, whose conservative opinion on social issues was well known in his social circle. He briefly reported how he had hired Marcus as a caregiver after a series of frustrated interviews with other candidates, mentioning his practical qualifications and the special connection he had developed with Margaret, but hesitating to immediately reveal the details about Marcus's prison past. David listened with growing attention, asking specific questions about Marcus's references and background, his investigative experience in real estate business allowing him to detect the hesitations and omissions in Benjamin's answers. When Benjamin finally admitted, under pressure from David's direct questions, that Marcus had served time in prison for theft, his neighbor's reaction was immediate and intense, his eyes widening with shock and disapproval that he didn't try to hide or minimize. David began to pace nervously around the room, gesticulating with agitation, while expressing his disbelief at Benjamin's decision, citing statistics about criminal recidivism and alarming stories he had heard about people who trusted ex-inmates and bitterly regretted it. The atmosphere in the room became tense as David bombarded Benjamin with arguments about the enormous risks he was taking, not just for Margaret, but for the entire family and property. "Benjamin, are you crazy? Putting a criminal inside your home? One day you'll regret it," said David, his voice loud and full of conviction, echoing off the walls of the room like a dark prophecy. David's words hit Benjamin like physical blows, awakening all the doubts and fears he had tried to suppress during the week, amplifying his instinctive concerns and giving voice to the anxieties he had tried to rationalize or ignore. Benjamin tried to defend his decision, explaining about Marcus's evident dedication and the notable improvement in Margaret's emotional state, but his words sounded weak and unconvincing even to his own ears when confronted with David's absolute certainty. His neighbor continued pressing, asking about security measures, about background checks, about contingency plans in case something went wrong, practical questions that Benjamin realized he had not adequately considered in his emotional decision to hire Marcus. David mentioned cases he had read in the newspapers about caregivers who abused the trust of vulnerable families, stealing property, committing fraud, or causing physical harm to defenseless elderly people. Terrifying scenarios that made Benjamin imagine possibilities that left him deeply disturbed. The conversation lasted for more than an hour, with David presenting increasingly convincing arguments about the dangers of the situation, while Benjamin found himself unable to adequately defend his decision against the seemingly irrefutable logic of the security arguments. When David finally left, he left behind an atmosphere heavy with doubt and paranoia that completely transformed Benjamin's perspective on Marcus's presence in his home. Perhaps David is right. Perhaps I've been too naive. How can I be sure that Marcus doesn't have ulterior motives? My mother is so vulnerable, thought Benjamin, feeling the crushing weight of responsibility and uncertainty about the decision he had made. As the afternoon turned into evening, Benjamin continued observing Marcus and Margaret in the garden, but now his eyes were filtered through the lens of suspicion planted by David, interpreting each gesture and each smile differently and potentially sinister. When he saw Marcus help Margaret drink an herbal tea he had prepared especially for her, Benjamin wondered about the ingredients and the intentions behind that apparent kindness. The stories that Marcus told to make Margaret laugh now seemed to Benjamin like possible psychological manipulations designed to gain her complete trust for hidden and malicious purposes. The affectionate way Marcus adjusted Margaret's shawl against the cool evening breeze, which previously seemed evidence of genuine care, now raised questions about ulterior motives and possible predation of a vulnerable person. Benjamin felt divided between what his eyes clearly saw, an elderly woman being cared for with dedication and affection, and what his mind was now programmed to suspect, a potentially dangerous criminal gaining access and trust for unknown purposes. When William came to announce that dinner was served, Benjamin decided it was time to confront the situation directly and establish clearer boundaries about Marcus's role in the house, determined to protect his mother even if it meant causing conflict and disappointment. "It's time to have a serious conversation. I need to make it clear who is in charge in this house. I cannot allow my mother to be manipulated by someone whose true intentions I don't know," Benjamin muttered to himself, mentally preparing for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. Dinner was served in the mansion's main dining room, an elegant setting with a dark wooden table and crystal chandeliers that created a formal atmosphere suitable for important family discussions. Margaret had been carefully positioned in her usual chair, with extra cushions for her comfort, while Marcus, following specific instructions from Benjamin, had been requested to join the family for the meal, an invitation that initially left him hesitant due to his awareness of social differences. William served the meal with his usual efficiency, but even the experienced butler could sense the growing tension in the air, noticing Benjamin's stern expression and the way he observed each of Marcus's movements with disturbing intensity. Margaret, oblivious to the suspicions that had developed during the afternoon, chatted cheerfully about her day in the garden, praising Marcus's dedication and expressing gratitude for the joy he had brought to her life in recent days. Her voice, though still weak, carried an animation that had not been heard for months, and she gestured gently as she described the flowers they had observed and the inspiring stories that Marcus had shared with her. Benjamin listened in growing silence, interpreting his mother's enthusiasm as evidence of how deeply she had been influenced by Marcus, which only intensified his concerns about emotional manipulation. "Benjamin, you should have seen how Marcus took care of me today. He has such a gentle soul. I feel blessed to have him in our family," said Margaret, her eyes shining with genuine affection as she looked lovingly at Marcus. The word family echoed in Benjamin's mind like an alarm, confirming his worst fears about the degree of influence that Marcus had acquired over Margaret in such a short time. Benjamin had planned to address his concerns diplomatically, but Margaret's mention of considering Marcus part of the family triggered an emotional reaction that he could not properly control. He placed his utensils on the table with more force than necessary, creating a metallic sound that cut through the previously pleasant atmosphere of the meal, and everyone present immediately noticed the change in his mood. Marcus, who had been eating in respectful silence and contributing only occasionally to the conversation when directly addressed, looked up and met Benjamin's intense gaze, instinctively realizing that something had drastically changed in the household dynamics. Margaret, surprised by the sudden shift in atmosphere, looked worriedly at her son, trying to understand the source of the tension that had seemingly emerged from nowhere during this meal that had begun so pleasantly. William, positioned discreetly near the sideboard, visibly tensed, mentally preparing himself for any situation that might develop from that emotion-laden moment. "Mother, we need to talk about some boundaries. About what is appropriate in this house. I think some things are getting out of control," said Benjamin, his voice controlled but laden with a firmness that indicated unshakable determination. Margaret frowned, clearly confused by the sudden change in Benjamin's behavior and the implication that something was wrong with the arrangement that had brought so much joy to her difficult days. She looked from Benjamin to Marcus, trying to comprehend the source of the developing conflict and why her son seemed to have developed a hostile attitude toward the man who had been so dedicated and caring toward her. Marcus remained silent, but his posture had become more alert, his years of experience in tense situations allowing him to recognize the signs of imminent confrontation, although he didn't fully understand what had provoked the dramatic change in Benjamin's attitude. Margaret, with the insight developed over decades of experience in human relationships, realized that Benjamin was about to say something that could deeply hurt both her and Marcus, and decided to take the initiative to defend the man who had become so important to her emotional well-being. She straightened in her chair as much as her physical condition allowed, assuming the dignified posture that had characterized her presence throughout life, preparing herself for a battle she knew was crucial to determine whether she could maintain the source of joy she had found in her last days. "Benjamin, if you have something to say about Marcus, say it directly. He has been wonderful to me, Height. I don't understand why you're acting so strangely." "He deserves respect and gratitude, not hostility," said Margaret, her voice gaining strength and determination that surprised everyone in the room. Benjamin felt challenged by Margaret's firm defense of Marcus, interpreting it as further confirmation that his mother had been emotionally compromised and was no longer capable of evaluating the situation objectively. David's words echoed in his mind, mixing with his own insecurities about losing the special connection he had always maintained with Margaret, creating an emotional storm that clouded his rational judgment. Benjamin rose abruptly from the table, his chair scraping against the wooden floor, and began to pace around the room with growing agitation, gesturing while mentally organizing the arguments he had rehearsed to justify his concerns. Marcus observed in silence, understanding that he was at the center of a complex family dynamic that involved much more than just his presence in the house, but feeling powerless to defend himself without appearing disrespectful or confrontational with the man who was paying his salary. Margaret remained seated with dignity, but her eyes followed Benjamin's every movement, preparing to defend her choice and her right to determine who could bring her comfort in the last months of her life. The tension in the room had become almost palpable, with William positioning himself discreetly, in a way that would allow him to intervene if necessary, although his loyalty was divided between protecting Benjamin and respecting Margaret's wishes. "Mother, can't you see what's happening? You're being manipulated. This man is not who you think he is," said Benjamin, stopping in front of the table and pointing directly at Marcus with clear accusation in his voice. Benjamin's direct accusation hit Margaret like a slap in the face, awakening an indignation she hadn't felt in a long time, and giving her energy for a passionate defense that surprised everyone with its emotional intensity. She slammed her fragile hand on the table with all the strength she could gather, creating a sound that echoed through the silent room like thunder, and her blue eyes shone with a fierce determination that recalled the strong woman she had been before illness debilitated her. Benjamin was momentarily stunned by his mother's vehement reaction, not expecting her to have energy for such a passionate defense, and Marcus instinctively rose from his chair, preparing himself for any eventuality that might develop from that explosive moment. Margaret began to speak with a strength in her voice that had been absent for months, each word loaded with absolute conviction and unwavering determination to protect the man who had brought light back into her life in the darkness of terminal illness. William stepped forward, concerned about the level of agitation Margaret was displaying, and aware that such emotional stress could be dangerous for her fragile health condition. "Benjamin, how dare you suggest that I don't know how to distinguish between genuine kindness and manipulation? Marcus has treated me with more care and respect than anyone in recent months, including you, who is always too busy with your business to notice that your mother is dying. He sees my soul, not just my disease, said Margaret, her voice trembling with intense emotion and tears of anger and frustration beginning to form in her eyes. Margaret's words hit Benjamin like stabs, especially the accusation that he had neglected her emotional needs in favor of his professional commitments, a painful truth that he had tried to avoid facing during months of denial and guilt. The direct comparison between his dedication and Marcus's was particularly devastating, forcing Benjamin to confront the reality that a stranger had managed to provide his mother with the kind of attention and care that he himself had failed to offer consistently. Benjamin felt a toxic mixture of guilt, anger, and fear of losing his mother to someone he perceived as a threat to his position as the most important son in her life, emotions that combined to produce an even more intense and irrational reaction. Marcus remained standing beside his chair, clearly uncomfortable being the center of such an intimate family conflict, but determined to remain respectful and not return any hostility that might be directed at him. Margaret continued her passionate defense of Marcus, citing specific examples of his dedication, from small daily kindnesses to moments of comfort during her pain crises, implicitly contrasting them with the rushed and distracted visits Benjamin had made to her room in recent months. The accusation of neglect touched Benjamin's most vulnerable point, triggering an emotional explosion that he had been suppressing for weeks, a combination of guilt, fear, and frustration that found a convenient target in Marcus's presence. "He's a criminal, Mother, you're mistaken!" Benjamin exploded, his voice echoing through the room like a war cry, all his frustrations and fears concentrated in those accusatory words. Benjamin's shout reverberated through the room like an explosion, creating a moment of absolute silence that was broken only by the sound of everyone's agitated breathing, the emotional tension having reached a critical point that threatened to destroy any possibility of peaceful reconciliation. Margaret was visibly shaken by the intensity of Benjamin's outburst, her face paling even more as she processed not just the words, but the anger and desperation behind them, realizing how deeply her son was disturbed by the situation. Marcus remained motionless, absorbing the impact of the accusatory words with the silent dignity of someone who had learned to endure judgments and prejudices. But the hurt in his eyes was visible to anyone who took the trouble to observe beyond labels and stereotypes. William took another step forward, his decades of experience in managing family crises allowing him to recognize that the situation was dangerously approaching a point of no return that could cause irreparable damage to relationships and Margaret's well-being. The atmosphere in the room had become electrically charged, with raw emotions exposed in a brutal way that left all participants vulnerable and wounded, the family's usual civility and courtesy having been shattered by the force of the underlying conflict. The intense emotional stress began to affect Margaret physically, her breathing becoming laborious as her fragile body struggled to process the emotional overload that Benjamin's explosion had created. "Benjamin, how can you call a criminal the man who brought me back to life?" said Margaret between difficult breaths, her failing voice reflecting both the emotional shock and the onset of a physical crisis that immediately alarmed Marcus. Suddenly, the intense emotional stress of the confrontation began to manifest physically in Margaret, who started coughing violently, her face contorting in pain as her fragile body was shaken by spasms that seemed to tear away her remaining life force. The cough rapidly intensified, transforming into a respiratory crisis that made everyone in the room instantly realize that the discussion had exceeded the point of safety for Margaret's delicate health. Benjamin was momentarily paralyzed by the horror of realizing that his emotional outburst had triggered exactly the type of medical crisis he most feared, his anger instantly replaced by panic and despair at seeing his mother suffering because of his actions. Marcus reacted immediately with the speed and competence of someone trained for medical emergencies, moving quickly to Margaret's side and positioning himself to offer physical support while rapidly assessing her condition and determining the necessary measures to stabilize her. William ran to fetch water and any emergency medication that might be needed, his experience with domestic emergencies allowing him to anticipate the needs of the critical situation that was developing. Margaret continued coughing with alarming intensity, her face gradually becoming paler as she struggled to regain control of her breathing, each spasm seeming to drain more of her limited energy and dangerously bringing her closer to complete unconsciousness. "Mrs. Margaret, stay calm. Breathe slowly with me. I'm here. You're safe," said Marcus, his voice firm but gentle, automatically assuming the role of caregiver, even amid the hostility that had been directed at him moments before. When Margaret began to sway dangerously in her chair, clearly about to faint due to the combination of emotional stress and respiratory difficulty, Marcus acted without hesitation, quickly positioning himself behind her and carefully wrapping his arms around her to prevent her from falling and hurting herself. His movements were precise and professional, demonstrating exactly the type of competence and dedication that Margaret had passionately defended just moments before, creating a contrast with the accusations that Benjamin had made about his intentions and character. Benjamin watched in horror, realizing that he had created exactly the situation he most feared, putting his mother's life at risk, and that now he depended on the man he had just verbally attacked to save her from the crisis he himself had provoked. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone present. The criminal that Benjamin had denounced was now the only person in the room with the competence and presence of mind to handle the medical emergency that threatened Margaret's life. William quickly returned with water and medications, but it was Marcus who coordinated the efforts to stabilize Margaret, his practical experience in crisis situations allowing him to remain calm and make the right decisions while others panicked. Margaret's breathing gradually began to stabilize under Marcus's competent care, who continued to physically support her while murmuring words of encouragement and reassurance, demonstrating exactly the kind of dedication and care that had motivated Margaret to defend him so passionately. "It's all right, Mrs. Margaret. I have you. You're safe in my arms. Breathe with me or talk slowly. You are strong. You will overcome this," murmured Marcus, his voice laden with genuine concern and determination to protect the woman who had become so important to him. Benjamin remained awake throughout the night, nervously walking the corridors of the mansion, while the events of dinner repeated incessantly in his mind like a nightmare that refused to disappear. Margaret's crisis had been controlled thanks to Marcus's prompt care, but the incident had left Benjamin tormented by contradictory feelings of gratitude and suspicion that consumed him from within. He had carried Margaret to her room after she recovered from fainting, observing how Marcus discreetly followed, remaining close like a silent guardian who would not abandon his post even after being verbally attacked. During the hours that followed, Benjamin found himself wandering the corridors of the mansion like a restless ghost, unable to find peace or sleep while processing the emotional complexity of the situation he had created. The rain had begun to fall heavily during the early morning, creating a melancholic soundtrack that echoed through the windows of the mansion and perfectly reflected the emotional turmoil that dominated his thoughts. The words of David continued to echo in his mind like a disturbing mantra, mixing with Margaret's accusations about his negligence as a son, creating an internal storm that prevented him from resting or finding mental clarity. How can I be sure of his true intentions? Am I protecting my mother or destroying her last chance for happiness? I can no longer distinguish between paranoia and prudence, thought Benjamin, pausing before Margaret's bedroom door while hearing muffled sounds coming from inside. It was approximately 3 in the morning when Benjamin, walking through the mansion corridors in another of his sleepless rounds, heard strange noises and low whispers coming from Margaret's room that immediately caught his attention and intensified his already elevated suspicions. The sounds were muffled and indistinct, but there was something in the quality of the murmurs that made him stop abruptly and pay full attention, his heart beginning to race as he imagined increasingly darker scenarios about what might be happening on the other side of the door. Benjamin silently approached the door, his bare feet making no noise on the Persian carpet covering the wooden floor, and pressed his ear against the polished wood to better discern the nature of the sounds emanating from within. What he heard left him deeply disturbed. A male voice murmuring incomprehensible words in a low, rhythmic tone, interspersed with movements suggesting physical activity of some kind, creating a set of sounds that his paranoid mind interpreted as potentially threatening. Benjamin's imagination, already inflamed by David's warnings and his own insecurities, began creating terrifying scenarios about what Marcus might be doing to his helpless mother during the vulnerable hours of early morning. Benjamin felt a mixture of paralyzing fear and growing anger, his hands trembling as he held the doorknob, internally debating whether he should burst in immediately or try to better understand the situation before acting. What is he doing to her? And why is he whispering like that? I need to enter now before it's too late. My mother could be in mortal danger, thought Benjamin, his breathing becoming agitated as he prepared to confront whatever was happening on the other side of the door. Without further hesitation, Benjamin turned the doorknob forcefully and burst into Margaret's room, prepared to face any terrible scenario his imagination had conjured, but completely unprepared for the complex scene his eyes encountered in the soft dimness of the room. The first thing he noticed was Margaret lying in bed, apparently unconscious, her breathing visible but laborious, creating an irregular pattern suggesting she was experiencing some kind of medical crisis during sleep. Beside the bed, Marcus was kneeling on the floor, his hands positioned on Margaret's chest where he had placed what appeared to be wet compresses made of cloths soaked in some type of dark liquid that exhaled an unknown and potent herbal aroma. The soft light from the bedside lamp created dancing shadows that distorted the scene, making Marcus's movements seem more sinister than they really were, especially to Benjamin's eyes, which were already predisposed to interpret anything suspiciously. Marcus was murmuring words in a low voice, his lips moving in rhythmic patterns that Benjamin could not understand, creating an atmosphere that to his agitated mind seemed more like an occult ritual than a legitimate medical procedure. The entire scene, Margaret unconscious, the dark compresses, the incomprehensible murmurs, Marcus's intimate position beside the bed, created in Benjamin's mind a narrative of danger and possible aggression that completely terrified him. My God, what is he doing to her? This looks like some kind of ritual. She's unconscious and he's... I can't allow this to continue. I need to protect her now, thought Benjamin, feeling a wave of panic and anger taking over him. Benjamin remained paralyzed for a few crucial seconds, observing the scene with growing horror, while trying to process what he was seeing through the lens of his amplified suspicions and fears. Marcus had not yet noticed his presence, completely focused on his task of applying the compresses and murmuring what Benjamin interpreted as suspicious enchantments or prayers, his total dedication to Margaret's care being misinterpreted as something potentially dangerous. Margaret's breathing remained irregular and laborious, and Benjamin could see that she was clearly in some kind of physical distress, but his paranoid mind immediately assumed that Marcus was the cause of the problem rather than trying to solve it. The compresses on Margaret's chest appeared to Benjamin as instruments of torture or elements of some dark ritual, and the fact that she was unconscious only intensified his fears about what might have been done to her while she was vulnerable. The aroma of herbs, which was objectively medicinal and soothing, was interpreted by Benjamin as evidence that some kind of potion or drug had been administered to Margaret without her knowledge or consent. Marcus, finally noticing Benjamin's presence, looked up to meet his gaze, and the expression of surprise and slight guilt that naturally appeared on his face was immediately interpreted by Benjamin as confirmation that he had interrupted something inappropriate or criminal. Benjamin, I can explain. Your mother was having difficulty breathing. These eucalyptus and chamomile compresses help open the airways. I learned this technique in prison from a man who was an herbalist. She was suffering greatly, said Marcus, his voice calm but clearly defensive, trying to explain his unconventional methods. Marcus's explanation, instead of reassuring Benjamin, only confirmed his worst suspicions about being deceived by someone who had perfected his manipulation techniques during years in prison among experienced criminals. Benjamin interpreted the mention of prison as confirmation that Marcus was using methods learned from other criminals, possibly techniques to subdue or harm defenseless people, and the fact that Margaret was unconscious seemed to prove that something terrible had been done to her. The words about medicinal herbs sounded to Benjamin like a euphemism for someone who knew how to use plants for sinister purposes, possibly to drug or poison people, especially considering that Margaret was clearly in an altered state of consciousness. The explanation about breathing difficulties was interpreted by Benjamin as an attempt to cover up something much more serious that had happened, possibly an attack or assault that had left Margaret unconscious and struggling to breathe. Benjamin approached the bed with quick, decisive steps, his protective instinct finally overcoming his initial paralysis, determined to remove Marcus from his mother's proximity before more harm could be done. Marcus rose slowly, keeping his hands visible in a non-threatening gesture. But Benjamin interpreted even this movement as evidence of guilty conscience and preparation for possible escape or fight. "You're lying. My mother never had breathing problems during the night. What did you really do to her? Why is she unconscious? These aren't medicinal compresses. This is some kind of dark ritual." "You drugged her," accused Benjamin, his voice trembling with anger and fear as he positioned himself defensively between Marcus and the bed. Marcus tried to explain in more detail what was happening, his words becoming more urgent, as he realized that Benjamin was interpreting the situation completely wrongly and potentially dangerous for Margaret if the care was abruptly interrupted. He described how Margaret had woken up about an hour earlier, coughing violently and struggling to breathe, a delayed consequence of the emotional stress from dinner that had affected her respiratory system, already compromised by illness. Marcus explained that he had prepared the compresses using a combination of anti-inflammatory herbs that he had learned to use to treat respiratory problems in other terminal patients, a natural technique that had proven effective in providing relief when conventional medications were not available or not sufficient. He tried to show Benjamin that the compresses were simply cloth soaked in herbal tea, nothing more sinister than a concentrated version of remedies that grandmothers had used for generations to treat respiratory problems. Marcus also explained that he was praying quietly because he believed that spiritual comfort was as important as physical care for people who were suffering, especially during moments of crisis when they were most vulnerable and frightened. His voice carried genuine concern and frustration as he tried to make Benjamin understand that each action had been motivated by the desire to help Margaret, not to harm her. "Please, Benjamin, you need to listen to me. She was suffering greatly when she woke up, couldn't breathe properly. These compresses are just concentrated herbal tea. I am praying that she finds peace and healing. Everything I'm doing is to help her, not to harm her. You have to trust me right now," Marcus pleaded, his voice filled with urgency as he tried to convince Benjamin of his good intentions. Benjamin completely rejected Marcus's explanations, interpreting each word as further evidence of manipulation and deception intended to cover up whatever terrible things had been done to Margaret during her vulnerable hours. The mention of prayer particularly irritated Benjamin, who saw this as inappropriate religious manipulation of a woman who was too weak to resist or protest against unwanted spiritual interventions. Benjamin demanded that Marcus step away from Margaret immediately, threatening to call the police if he did not comply, his voice loud enough to disturb whatever peaceful rest Margaret might be having despite her condition. Marcus, seeing that reasonable explanation wasn't going to work, and genuinely concerned about Margaret's condition if proper care were interrupted, tried a different approach by offering to wake Margaret so she could speak for herself about what had happened and what she wanted. Benjamin interpreted this suggestion as evidence that Marcus was confident that Margaret had been drugged or harmed in some way, enough that she would not be able to give coherent testimony about what had really occurred during those dark hours. The impasse between the two men continued for several tense minutes, with Marcus desperately trying to maintain access to Margaret so he could continue providing care he believed was critical to her survival, while Benjamin became increasingly convinced he was witnessing the aftermath of some kind of criminal activity. Margaret remained unconscious throughout this confrontation, her breathing still labored, but gradually improving thanks to the effects of the herbal compresses, although Benjamin could not see this improvement through his lens of suspicion and fear. "You think I'm a fool? This story about prayer and herbal medicine is just a disguise for what you really did to her. She's unconscious because you gave her something. Step away from her right now before I call the authorities," declared Benjamin, his voice full of finality and threat. The situation escalated rapidly when Benjamin, seeing that Marcus was reluctant to leave Margaret's side during what he believed to be a critical moment in her care, interpreted this reluctance as confirmation of guilt and determined that immediate action was necessary to protect his mother from further harm. Benjamin grabbed Marcus's arm forcefully, trying to physically pull him away from the bedside, an action that Marcus naturally resisted because he was genuinely concerned about leaving Margaret in her current state without proper monitoring and care. This physical confrontation, brief though it was, confirmed for Benjamin that he was dealing with someone who was willing to use violence to maintain access to the vulnerable victim, and it triggered a wave of protective anger that overcame any remaining hesitation about taking decisive action. Marcus, trying to avoid escalating the physical confrontation that might further disturb Margaret, attempted to back away, but also tried to explain once more that leaving Margaret alone in her current condition could be genuinely dangerous to her health and well-being. Benjamin interpreted these continued protests as desperate attempts by a criminal to maintain access to his victim, and his anger reached boiling point when he realized this man was still trying to manipulate him even when caught in apparent wrongdoing. The noise of their confrontation began to disturb Margaret, who started to stir restlessly in her sleep, her breathing becoming more agitated as she sensed the conflict happening around her, even if she couldn't fully wake to understand what was occurring. Benjamin, seeing his mother's distress and interpreting it as evidence that she was indeed the victim of some kind of assault or poisoning, felt a surge of protective fury that gave him the strength to take definitive action against the perceived threat to her safety. "I don't care what excuses you make up. You will not stay in this house one more minute. Whatever you did to her, it ends right now. I won't let you hurt her anymore," shouted Benjamin, his voice filled with absolute conviction and determination to remove what he saw as immediate danger to his mother's life. Benjamin grabbed Marcus with greater force, practically dragging him toward the door, while continuing to verbally attack him with accusations about drugging Margaret and taking advantage of her vulnerable state during the night hours when no one else was around to witness any crimes that may have been committed. Marcus, realizing that the situation had completely spiraled out of control and that Benjamin was beyond the reach of reason in his current emotional state, reluctantly allowed himself to be pulled away from Margaret's bedside, but continued trying to explain that leaving her alone during a respiratory crisis could have serious consequences for her health. Benjamin interpreted even this final attempt at explanation as evidence of how manipulative and calculating Marcus really was, using fake concern for the victim as a tool to maintain access and continue whatever harmful activities had been interrupted. The physical struggle continued down the hallway, with Benjamin pushing and pulling Marcus toward the front door, while Marcus continued to protest that Margaret needed immediate medical attention that only he was qualified to provide, given his experience with respiratory emergencies in terminal patients. Benjamin was now completely convinced that he was dealing with a dangerous criminal who had been caught in the act of harming an elderly victim and was trying every possible manipulation to avoid consequences and maintain access to continue harmful activities. William appeared in the hallway, awakened by the commotion, but Benjamin quickly explained that he had caught Marcus doing something terrible to Margaret and that he was removing the threat from the house immediately to protect his mother from further harm. William, seeing Benjamin's agitated state and remembering his own initial concerns about hiring an ex-convict, did not question this decision, but instead helped escort Marcus toward the exit while Marcus continued to protest about Margaret's condition. "Listen to me carefully. Margaret is in serious respiratory distress. These herbal treatments need to continue throughout the night to prevent complications. If you remove me now, she may suffer a serious setback that could threaten her life. Please don't let your suspicions override her medical needs," pleaded Marcus, making one final desperate attempt to convince Benjamin that his concerns were medical and not criminal. Benjamin remained absolutely unmoved by Marcus's final pleas, interpreting them as definitive proof of how dangerous and manipulative this man really was, using false medical emergency as an excuse to maintain access to the victim even when caught in suspicious circumstances. The rain was falling heavily outside, creating dangerous conditions that would make travel difficult and potentially risky, but Benjamin was determined to remove the perceived threat from his home immediately, regardless of the weather or the time of night. Benjamin forcefully opened the front door, allowing wind and rain to enter the elegant hallway, as he prepared to physically expel Marcus from the property without any consideration for his safety or well-being in the adverse weather conditions. Marcus, seeing that Benjamin was absolutely determined to expel him, and knowing that continued resistance would only make the situation worse for everyone involved, reluctantly moved toward the door while making a final attempt to convince Benjamin to at least check on Margaret regularly throughout the night to ensure that her condition did not dangerously deteriorate. Benjamin pushed Marcus out into the pouring rain, his expensive clothes immediately becoming soaked as the cold wind cut through the fabric. But Benjamin felt no sympathy for the man he believed had threatened the safety of his beloved mother during her most vulnerable hours. William stood at the door, uncertain about the situation, but trusting Benjamin's judgment about what was best for the family's safety, while the rain continued to fall heavily, creating treacherous conditions for anyone forced to travel during such weather. Benjamin stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light from inside the mansion, his face showing a mixture of triumph and righteous anger as Marcus stood in the rain, his figure already becoming obscured by darkness and storm. "Get off my property and never come back. If I see you near my mother again, I'll have you arrested. You're finished here." "Find somewhere else to prey on innocent people," shouted Benjamin through the rain, his final words carrying absolute finality and rejection. Marcus, standing in the pouring rain with his clothes quickly becoming soaked and his hair stuck to his head, made a final and desperate attempt to convince Benjamin that he was making a terrible mistake that could cost Margaret's life during the critical hours when she most needed professional care from someone who understood her specific medical needs. His voice, raised to be heard over the sound of the heavy rain and wind, carried genuine desperation and fear for Margaret's well-being rather than concern for his own comfort or employment. But Benjamin was beyond hearing anything except confirmation of his own fears and suspicions about this man's true character and intentions. Marcus knew that leaving Margaret alone during a respiratory crisis went against everything he had learned about caring for terminal patients, and that complications could develop rapidly during the nighttime hours when the patient was most vulnerable and unable to call for help if breathing difficulties significantly worsened. The rain continued to fall heavily, soaking both men completely, while occasional lightning illuminated their figures in dramatic confrontation that seemed to capture all the tension and misunderstanding that had been building between them since the moment when Benjamin first began to doubt the motivations behind Marcus's dedicated care for his mother. Benjamin remained standing in the doorway, unmoved by the weather conditions or by Marcus's obvious suffering, his determination to protect Margaret from the perceived threat overriding any consideration for basic human decency or compassion for the man being expelled in dangerous storm conditions. William remained nearby, ready to intervene if the situation became even more heated, but clearly supporting Benjamin's decision to remove someone he too had viewed with suspicion since the moment when he first learned about Marcus's criminal past during the interview process. "You think you can fool me with fake concern, but I know what kind of person you really are. Predators like you always target vulnerable elderly people because they're easy victims. But you chose the wrong family this time," declared Benjamin, his voice cutting through the rain with absolute conviction about the righteousness of his actions. Marcus, realizing that no amount of pleading or explanations would convince Benjamin to reconsider his decision in his current emotional state, instead focused his final words on specific medical instructions that might help Benjamin provide basic care for Margaret during the remaining hours of the night, when complications were most likely to develop without professional monitoring. He shouted specific details about signs to watch for that would indicate respiratory distress, symptoms that would require immediate medical intervention, and basic positioning techniques that could help Margaret breathe more easily if her condition worsened during his forced absence from the house. Benjamin interpreted even these final medical instructions as elaborate manipulation designed to create fear and dependency that would force him to bring Marcus back, a final attempt by a sophisticated criminal to maintain access to the victim through psychological manipulation when physical presence was no longer possible. The rain intensified even further, creating nearly impossible conditions for conversation but Marcus persisted in trying to convey critical information that could potentially save Margaret's life during the hours when she would be most vulnerable without proper medical supervision from someone trained to recognize and respond to respiratory emergencies. Benjamin began to close the door, cutting off any possibility of further communication. His patience completely exhausted and his determination to end this confrontation absolute, regardless of anything else Marcus might try to say or any claim he might make about medical necessity for his continued presence in the house. Marcus, seeing the door beginning to close and realizing that this was his absolutely final opportunity to warn Benjamin about the potential consequences of removing medical care during a critical period, raised his voice to maximum volume to ensure that his final warning would be heard despite the wind, rain, and Benjamin's obvious desire to end the conversation immediately. "If you stop me, she won't survive the next night," shouted Marcus, his voice laden with desperate urgency, as Benjamin slammed the door shut, cutting off any further communication and leaving Marcus alone in the storm to face an uncertain future, while Margaret remained inside, unaware that her dedicated caregiver had been forcibly removed during the moment when she most needed professional medical attention to survive through the dangerous nighttime hours. Morning arrived with a terrifying discovery that confirmed the worst fears Marcus had expressed in his final words the night before. Benjamin found Margaret in her room completely unconscious, her breathing so faint it was barely perceptible, and all efforts to wake her failed miserably. William had entered the room to bring breakfast and immediately realized something was terribly wrong, urgently calling Benjamin to check Margaret's alarming state. When Benjamin saw his mother in that critical condition, he felt as if the world was crumbling around him, instantly realizing that Marcus's warnings about her survival during the night hadn't been manipulation, but an accurate medical prediction. The ambulance was called again, and during the desperate journey to the hospital, Benjamin held Margaret's cold hand while paramedics worked to stabilize her dangerously low vital signs. Marcus's words constantly echoed in his mind, like a dark prophecy that had become reality. She truly hadn't survived the night without the specialized care he had provided with such affection and dedication. My God, what have I done? Marcus was trying to save her and I threw him out like a criminal. Now my mother might die because of my insane paranoia, thought Benjamin, tears streaming down his face as he watched Margaret's critical condition on the ambulance stretcher. At the hospital, Dr. Richardson examined Margaret extensively, performing every possible test to determine the cause of her sudden comatose state, but the results only confirmed the bewildering complexity of her current medical condition. After hours of detailed examinations and consultations with specialists, the doctor approached Benjamin with a grave expression that reflected both professional concern and scientific perplexity about Margaret's case. Benjamin anxiously awaited the results, mentally preparing himself to receive devastating news about his mother's condition. But what he heard was even more disturbing than he had imagined. Dr. Richardson explained that all tests were technically normal, with no evidence of significant physical deterioration that would justify Margaret's comatose state, creating a medical mystery that defied conventional explanation. The absence of identifiable medical causes for her current state made the situation even more distressing for Benjamin, who began to understand that psychological and emotional factors might be playing a crucial role in Margaret's condition. "Mr. Benjamin, the tests are normal, but she won't wake up. It's as if she's lost the will to live. It seems she's given up fighting. Sometimes this happens when terminal patients lose something or someone very important to them," explained Dr. Richardson, his words hitting Benjamin like physical blows that confirmed his worst suspicions about having caused this crisis. Benjamin spent the following hours walking through the sterile hospital corridors like a tormented man, constantly reliving the events of the previous night and torturing himself with the growing realization that he had committed a catastrophic mistake that could cost his mother's life. During these long hours of agonizing reflection, Benjamin was forced to confront painful truths about his relationship with Margaret and about how he had allowed paranoia and prejudice to obscure his judgment about the man who truly cared for her. He vividly remembered how Margaret smiled in Marcus's presence, a genuine joy he hadn't seen on her face for months before the dedicated caregiver's arrival. The memories of those happy moments in the garden, when Margaret had seemed truly alive and content for the first time since her cancer diagnosis, now haunted him with a painful clarity that revealed how blind he had been to the good Marcus was doing. Benjamin realized he had completely misinterpreted Marcus's nighttime care, seeing threat where there was only compassionate dedication, and that his decision to expel the caregiver had deprived Margaret of exactly the person who most motivated her to continue fighting. How could I have been so blind? She was happy with him, truly happy for the first time in months, and I destroyed that because of my stupid prejudices. Now she has given up because she lost the only person who truly understood her pain, thought Benjamin, feeling the crushing weight of guilt and regret. As the hours passed and Margaret's condition remained unchanged, Benjamin began to understand with devastating clarity that he needed to find Marcus and beg for his forgiveness and help, even if it meant completely swallowing his pride and publicly admitting that he had misjudged an innocent man. The realization that Marcus could be the only person capable of motivating Margaret to fight for her life again became a growing obsession that dominated all of Benjamin's thoughts during those desperate hours of hospital vigil. Benjamin knew that finding Marcus would be extremely difficult, especially considering that he had thrown him out during a storm without money or resources, possibly forcing him to seek shelter in precarious places in the city. The guilt of having put an innocent man at risk during dangerous weather conditions added to the remorse for having separated Margaret from the only source of joy and comfort she had found during her battle against terminal illness. Benjamin began to make frantic plans to leave the hospital and search for Marcus in the streets, determined to find him regardless of how long it took or how humiliating the process of admitting his mistakes might be. Throughout this mental torture, the storm continued outside, creating even more difficult conditions for his planned search, but Benjamin was willing to face any adversity to try to save his mother. I need to find him, no matter where he is. I need to beg for his forgiveness and convince him to come back. He is the only hope my mother has of wanting to live again, Benjamin muttered to himself, mentally preparing to go out into the storm. When Benjamin finally left the hospital in tears under the pouring rain, his desperate search for Marcus became a journey of personal redemption that forced him to confront not only his prejudices, but also his failures as a dedicated son. He wandered the wet streets of the city for hours, checking homeless shelters, asking people on the streets, visiting social assistance centers, and any place where someone without resources might seek refuge during a storm. The rain completely soaked his expensive clothes, but Benjamin didn't care about his physical comfort, driven only by the desperate urgency to find the man he had unjustly expelled and who now represented the last hope of saving Margaret. During this exhaustive search, Benjamin had time to deeply reflect on how he had allowed the prejudiced opinions of others to influence his judgment about Marcus's character, ignoring all evidence of his genuine dedication and authentic compassion. It was only during these lonely hours on the streets that Benjamin truly understood how much he had been influenced by social prejudices instead of evaluating Marcus based on his demonstrated actions and character. He remembered each moment of care Marcus had shown to Margaret, each smile he had put on her face, each hour of patient care he had provided, and felt overwhelming shame for having interpreted all of this as manipulation. Where are you, Marcus? Help me save my mother, please. I was wrong about everything, but my mother needs you. I need you, Benjamin shouted into the rain, his words getting lost in the wind as he continued his desperate search. It was already in the early hours of the morning, after hours of fruitless searching, that Benjamin finally found Marcus in a temporary shelter for vulnerable people, a humble place that contrasted drastically with the luxury of the mansion where he had worked. Marcus was sitting in a quiet corner, his clothes still damp from the eviction the night before, his distant eyes reflecting a deep sadness that was not just about his own situation, but clearly about genuine concern for Margaret. When Marcus saw Benjamin approaching, soaked and visibly desperate, his first reaction was not one of anger or resentment, but of immediate alarm about what could have happened to Margaret to bring Benjamin there in such a state. Benjamin knelt before Marcus, a gesture of humility that shocked not only the former caregiver, but also other people in the shelter who witnessed a clearly rich and powerful man publicly humbling himself before someone they assumed to be just another homeless person. The tears streamed freely down Benjamin's face while he begged for forgiveness, fully admitting his errors of judgment and desperately explaining Margaret's critical condition and how the doctors had confirmed that she seemed to have lost the will to live. Marcus listened in silence, his expression changing from surprise to growing concern as he understood the gravity of the situation and how his predictions about the previous night had become tragic reality. "Forgive me. I need you. My mother needs you. I was completely wrong about your intentions. You are the only person who can motivate her to fight again. Please come back with me," Benjamin pleaded, his voice broken by emotion and genuine despair. Marcus, despite all the humiliation and injustice he had suffered, did not hesitate for even a moment when he understood that Margaret was in danger, demonstrating once again that his dedication to her transcended any consideration for his own well-being or personal dignity. He rose immediately, his concerns about Margaret completely overwhelming any resentment he might have harbored against Benjamin for treating him so poorly the night before. During the trip back to the hospital, Marcus questioned Benjamin about the specific symptoms Margaret had presented, demonstrating detailed medical knowledge about complications that could arise in terminal patients under extreme emotional stress. Benjamin realized during this conversation how foolish he had been to question Marcus's medical competence, who clearly possessed a deep understanding of palliative care that went far beyond what any formal training could have provided. When they arrived at the hospital, Marcus wasted no time with formalities or recriminations, going straight to Margaret's room and immediately assuming his role as caregiver with professionalism that impressed even the hospital medical staff. Benjamin watched in amazement as Marcus quickly assessed Margaret's condition, checking her vital signs and positioning with competence that rivaled any professional nurse Benjamin had known. The transformation in Marcus was remarkable. From a dejected man at the shelter to a focused and determined caregiver who clearly knew exactly what to do to help Margaret. "She's in deep emotional shock. Lost hope when I was removed from her. I will try to reconnect her with reasons to live. But I need your help, Benjamin. She needs to know that you two are united in loving her," Marcus explained, immediately beginning his preparations for what Benjamin realized would be a procedure very different from any conventional medical treatment. Marcus asked permission to bring some herbs he had left at the mansion, explaining that he needed to create a familiar and comforting environment that Margaret would associate with moments of peace and happiness they had shared. Benjamin, now completely humble and willing to fully trust Marcus's judgment, immediately agreed and even offered to personally fetch anything Marcus considered necessary for Margaret's care. When Marcus returned with his herbs and began to prepare the familiar compresses that Margaret had come to associate with comfort and care, Benjamin finally understood what he had really witnessed the previous night in Margaret's room. Observing Marcus work with meticulous care and evident affection, Benjamin realized how his paranoid interpretations had distorted acts of compassion into suspicions of criminality, a judgment error that had almost cost his mother's life. Marcus gently positioned the compresses on Margaret's chest, exactly as he had done the night before, but this time Benjamin could clearly see the therapeutic and caring nature of each movement. Then Marcus did something that deeply surprised Benjamin. Instead of simply praying alone as he had done before, he invited Benjamin to participate in the prayer, explaining that Margaret needed to feel the combined love of both of them to find motivation to return to consciousness. "Benjamin, your mother needs to feel that you both are united in love for her. She needs to know there is no more conflict between us, that we are together caring for her. Please kneel beside me and hold her hand as we pray together," Marcus asked, extending his own hand to Benjamin in a gesture of reconciliation and unity. For the first time in his adult life, Benjamin knelt humbly beside his mother's bed, not as a powerful man accustomed to commanding situations, but as a desperate son who had learned that true love required humility and faith that went beyond material wealth. Marcus led a prayer of faith that touched Benjamin's heart deeply, simple yet powerful words that asked not only for Margaret's physical healing, but for peace, forgiveness, and family unity that transcended the differences and misunderstandings that had caused so much suffering. Benjamin held Margaret's hand while tears streamed down his face, finally understanding that his mother had found in Marcus not just a competent caregiver, but a kind soul who offered the type of spiritual and emotional love that she most needed during her final moments of life. During the prayer, Benjamin felt a transformation happening within him, a fundamental shift in perspective that made him understand that true wealth was in the capacity to love and care for others with genuine compassion, qualities that Marcus possessed in abundance despite his humble origins. The experience of praying alongside Marcus, holding Margaret's hand, connected Benjamin with a spiritual dimension of existence that his materially focused life had neglected, providing him with a sense of peace and purpose that he had never experienced before. Lord, forgive us for the mistakes we've made. Heal not just Margaret's body, but also our hearts. Help us to be worthy of the love she offers us. Allow her to feel our unity and find reasons to continue with us, prayed Benjamin, his sincere words mingling with those of Marcus in an emotional harmony that filled the hospital room with energy of love and hope. During the minutes that followed the joint prayer, Benjamin and Marcus remained silent by Margaret's side, carefully observing any sign of improvement in her condition, now united in common purpose that completely transcended their previous differences. The hospital room, which had earlier seemed cold and sterile, was now filled with an atmosphere of love and hope that both men could feel tangibly as they maintained dedicated vigil over the woman they both deeply loved. Benjamin observed Marcus carefully, noting how his hands remained gentle on the compresses, how his eyes never left Margaret's face, how his presence radiated calm and confidence that dramatically contrasted with the agitation Benjamin had felt during the previous hours. Gradually, Benjamin began to notice subtle changes in Margaret's breathing, a more regular and deep pattern that suggested she was responding to the combined presence and unified care she now received from both men in her life. The color in her face began to improve slightly, and her facial muscles seemed to relax in a way that indicated that the stress and anxiety that had contributed to her comatose state were beginning to diminish. Marcus observed these changes with professional satisfaction, but Benjamin could see that his joy was much more personal, the genuine happiness of someone who truly cared about Margaret's well-being, regardless of any personal benefit he might receive. She's responding. I can feel that she's coming back to us. The love she's feeling is giving her strength to fight again. Keep holding her hand, Benjamin. She needs to know that you are here and that we've reconciled, whispered Marcus, encouraging Benjamin to maintain the physical and emotional contact that was clearly making a difference in Margaret's condition. Then, in a moment that Benjamin knew he would remember for the rest of his life, Margaret began to open her eyes slowly, her consciousness gradually returning as she processed the environment around her and the familiar presences she felt nearby. Her blue eyes, although still weak, shone with recognition and relief when they focused first on Marcus, then on Benjamin, and finally on the vision of both men united beside her bed in harmony that she had wished for but not dared to hope. Benjamin held his breath as he watched his mother return to consciousness, knowing that this moment represented not just her physical recovery, but also the restoration of relationships that had been nearly destroyed by misunderstandings and prejudices. Margaret tried to speak, her voice still weak but carrying deep emotion, as she processed the reality of having both men she loved caring for her in unity instead of the conflict that had caused so much pain the night before. Marcus smiled discreetly, his joy contained but evident as he watched Margaret return to them, knowing that his decision to forgive Benjamin and return despite all the suffering had been justified by the positive outcome they now witnessed. Benjamin felt a wave of gratitude and relief so intense that it threatened to completely overwhelm him, realizing that he had received not only his mother back, but also a valuable lesson about humility, forgiveness, and the true nature of unconditional love. Benjamin, my son, you're finally here, said Margaret, her voice soft but full of meaning, as she squeezed Benjamin's hand and looked at Marcus with gratitude that communicated everything she needed to express about having both important men united in her care. Benjamin embraced his mother with infinite tenderness, tears of joy and relief streaming down his face, as he felt the warmth of her body and strength gradually returning to her muscles, tangible signs that she was truly returning to life thanks to the power of unified love that now surrounded her. Marcus remained discreetly at their side, observing the reunion between mother and son with silent satisfaction, knowing that his mission of caring for Margaret had been fulfilled not only in medical terms, but also in restoring the family harmony she so desired during her final months of life. Benjamin looked at Marcus over Margaret's shoulder, his eyes communicating deep gratitude and respect that words could never adequately express, knowing that this man had saved not only his mother's life, but also his own soul through lessons about compassion, forgiveness, and genuine humility. The scene closed on that perfect moment of reconciliation and love, with Margaret safe in Benjamin's arms, while Marcus smiled discreetly, all three finally united in harmony that represented the true miracle of faith and filial love that had triumphed over prejudice, pride, and misunderstandings that nearly destroyed their lives. The hospital room, which had been the setting for so much despair and pain, now shone with the light of renewed hope and unconditional love that promised to make Margaret's remaining days the most precious and meaningful of all. Thank you. Thank you for teaching me what really matters. Thank you for saving my mother. Thank you for saving me too, whispered Benjamin to Marcus, his words sealing a friendship and mutual respect that would last for as long as Margaret still had with them, time that would now be filled with love, dignity, and the peace she had always deserved. Now tell me in the comments where you're from and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on screen. I'll be waiting for you there.